Our next speaker is an expert in this field. He knows a thing or two about how to craft stories that help teams to align for collaboration towards a desired future. He is a speechwriter and the founder of the Matham Group, a Beverly Hills-based leadership training firm, and he coined the term of story-based leadership. Today, he will share with us his view on the secret behind Steve Jobs' success. So please welcome to the stage, Christopher Kai.
So let's talk about story-based leadership, the secret behind Steve Jobs' success. Let's first define what story-based leadership is. It's when a leader uses their story as a basis for the success. When you look at the 10 most admired companies in the world, according to Fortune magazine, every single one of these leaders on this list are story-based leaders. I'm going to focus on 3 today. For my European friends, did you know that Howard Schultz, the former CEO of Starbucks, his first trip to Milan, Italy in 1983, he gets to Italy, he's sitting at the espresso bars, and he's like amazed. He's inspired. He's looking at the interaction between the baristas and the customers, and he's like, wow, they have a real connection, they have a real community. He brings his Italian experience back to the States, and he wants to create and recreate this Italian experience. Otherwise, Starbucks is just a coffee shop. Look at someone like Walt Disney. For the Danish in the room, Walt Disney flies to Copenhagen, Denmark, visits Tivoli Gardens, the second oldest amusement park in the world, and fiercely jots down notes because he's so inspired, takes those inspirations from Copenhagen, brings it back to the States, and creates Disneyland. A more recent executive at Disney, his name is Doug Lipp. Doug found that when he researched companies, he found that every single successful company all have 2 leaders that work hand in hand. You have the promoter, the marketer, the storyteller, and you have the more analytics, the logics, the finance person. In Disney's case, Walt Disney was the promoter, storyteller. His brother, Roy Disney, was the finance guy. When you look at Apple, no one will argue that Steve Wozniak was the brains behind the Apple products. He was a programming guy. But Wozniak also openly says that if not for Steve Jobs, there wouldn't be no Apple, because Steve Wozniak just gave away things. But Steve Jobs was a promoter. He was a marketer. People sell products. Products don't sell themselves. And the people that sell the best products are story-based leaders like Steve Jobs. Just the very name Apple. Steve knew that people fear things they don't know. And back in the 70s, people fear computers because they're like, what are these things called computers? So what does Steve do? I'm going to name my company called Apple because it's a really cute word and it's a nice fruit. Who can be afraid of apples? He was also a fruitarian because he liked eating apples. But lastly, back in that day, they actually had phone books with business directories, and he used to work at Atari, so we called it Apple because Apple was before Atari. Now, Steve Jobs also understood how to persuade. Aristotle talked about persuasion in ethos, logos, and pathos. So the ethos is this. Based on my credibility, if I say to you, I used to work for American Express on Wall Street where I built out global sales decks for our largest, biggest clients in the world. I've written 5, 6 books, and I've given over 1,000 presentations in the world. That's the credibility, but that's not as important as the logos part, which is the facts and figures. When I say to you that stories are 22 times more memorable than facts, that's not my opinion, that's based on science. But the most important thing about persuasion is pathos. There's an author named Carmine Gallo. He wrote a book called Talk Like TED. And he found that 65% of our effectiveness as communicators was based on the pathos, which was the storytelling, the emotion behind everything. And Steve Jobs was brilliant at this. When you talk about the smartphone, you talk about this experience that you're having when you're opening up a box to see a phone. And the most brilliant thing that Steve Jobs did was he combined storytelling with persuasion and images. According to 3M, they studied that images are 60,000 times absorbed faster than words. And if you look at the epiphanous campaign called Think Different that he created about 20 years ago with Shad Day, an agency based in LA, If you watch this 1-minute video, it's a genius. The music cues, there's this beautiful string instruments and piano playing in the background, and Richard Dreyfuss' voice says, "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers." And as his suave, smooth voice is heard and the background music is listened to, you have an image of Albert Einstein and Bob Dylan and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Richard Branson. And by the end of this video, they say, "They call them crazy, but we see genius. And those that they're crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones that do." And the music fades. And then you sit there watching this, and you're like, wow, I want to buy an Apple product now. Because it's an experience. Howard Schultz understood the experience of creating a community in Starbucks. Walt Disney understood that the experience of going to the Disneyland was a purely amazing and powerful experience. And Steve Jobs knew that if he wanted to persuade and create a program and create a company that's sustainable, he knew about storytelling. So I believe all of you can be story-based leaders, and these are 3 very specific ways you can do that. You need to understand how to share 3 types of stories. The first one is the personal one, and I'll share my own with you right now. I was born and raised in New York City. My mother was a school teacher. My father was a case manager. The first memory I had as a kid in school was my teacher, the person I looked up to, the person I admired, looking down at me and saying, "Christopher, shut up." Now, of course, she didn't say that because that would be like child abuse. But she implied that when she told me and silenced my voice by punishing me and saying, "Christopher, you're talking too much, you're staying after class, and you're going to write, 'I will not talk in class' 100 times and 200 times. And my 3rd grade teacher was so angry at me, she made me write it 500 times, and I'm 8 years old. I also had a reading disability, so now I was not just getting punished for talking too much, I didn't feel very smart, but the most challenging thing for me growing up was I was very short. I was the shortest kid in my class for all 8 years, and what do they do with the shortest kid in class? Every time we lined up to go to the recess, to the cafeteria, to the gym, back to the homeroom, they would always line the shortest kid in the front of the class. So the most insecure thing I had about myself was my height, and they just paraded me around with my insecurity. But thankfully, I would grow a little taller, grow a little more bold, and how ridiculous is it that I travel the world as a speaker, as a corporate trainer. I teach executives how to be better speakers, even though I was punished as a kid for speaking too much in class. I also had a chance to interview hundreds of entrepreneurs, including Mr. Elon Musk, who he himself has a powerful story. Now, Elon often says, "We don't spend money on advertising." What he forgets to mention that his life story is the advertisement. Who doesn't want to be like Elon Musk? Powerful billionaire, likes to change the world. Pretty cool, right? Next type of story is this. Have your professional story, your business story. People always ask me, why did you name your company called the Maven Group? Prior to calling it the Maven Group, it was called KGL, and it stands for King, Gandhi, Bruce Lee. The 3 story-based leaders that I most respect in life to keep my ideals high. But Maven Group, Maven is a word I created. It's an acronym for Mondays at the Mission. On September 2nd, 2010, I walked into the Union Rescue Mission, the largest private homeless shelter in Los Angeles. I'm based in primarily Los Angeles and Miami. It's a massive facility. It's 225,000 square foot, 5 stories tall. They house 1,200 men, women, and kids. About 100 of those are kids. And at 1 year, they served over 1 million meals. So I'm getting a tour of this facility on September 2nd, 2010. I walk up to the 3rd floor. I see this massive gymnasium. I walk into the gymnasium, and I see this little girl named Hannah. She's 8 years old. She runs up to me and says, "Do you want to play jump rope?" And I look at this little beautiful girl, thinking to myself, here I am in a homeless shelter, the largest one of its kind in the country. Right outside, there's pimps, prostitutes, drug dealers, drug addicts, pedophiles, rapists, and murderers. And this little girl, Hannah, asked me to play jump rope. And as I'm playing jump rope with little Hannah and the CEO of the shelter named Andy Bales, my heart is really, really, really heavy. And I decided in that moment, as Gandhi always reminds us, we must be the change we wish to see. I start teaching career and life skill classes. 8.5 years later, Mondays at the Mission is the only homeless youth program in its kind where we teach weekly career and life skill classes for homeless teenagers that live at the largest shelter. I created this company called the Maven Group to remind myself, I'm a capitalist, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm an executive, but I want every person on my team, every friend, every client to know that I'm here to serve you as your professional. The last story that you want to think about is the story of your country. It's not just about yourself or your family or your company, it's about your country. In July of this year, it'll mark the 50th anniversary of the first man on the moon. In the early 1960s, my president, US President John F. Kennedy, created a speech and said, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it is hard, not because it is easy, because it is hard." And in that one statement, it symbolizes who we are as Americans, that we are entrepreneurial, we are bold, and we are courageous. I'm going to end with one final question I want to ask of all of you. Will you be remembered as the Steve Jobs of your company or the Ronald Wayne? Apple Computers had 3 co-founders. It was Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne. Ronald Wayne drafted the first Apple logo. He wrote the first partnership contract, and he also wrote the first operating manual. He unfortunately was not as risky as Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. He was in his 40s by that point. And so he decided less than 2 weeks later to sell his 10% shares of Apple for $800. That 10% shares of Apple would have been worth $100 billion. So my question to you is, we all have Steve Jobs and Ronald Wayne in us. But will you have the courage to pursue your dreams? Will you face your fears and forge ahead? Or will you allow your fears to cripple you into inaction? Because now that you know how to share stories, persuade, and become a story-based leader, I believe you can share your story with the world because your story is a gift to the world. Thank you.